Welcome. Tonight, you will fall asleep to the lore of one of the great strategy games of all time, Age of Empires 2, a game that has been played in various forms since 1999. A game that took the long, real history of the medieval world, its wars, its kings, its rebellions, its sieges, and turned it into stories you could play. But Age of Empires is not just a game. It is a history book disguised as entertainment. The campaigns are based on real people, real battles, real centuries of suffering and triumph. When you play as William Wallace, you are playing through the actual rebellion of Scotland against England. When you play as Joan of Arc, you are walking the actual path she walked from her village to the stake. When you play as Saladin, you are leading the actual armies that took Jerusalem back from the Crusaders. The game gave you the units, the buildings, the economy, the technology trees. But behind all of that was the lore, the cinematic cutscenes, the voiceovers, the history. Tonight, we will walk through 6 of these campaigns. 6 stories of medieval kings and rebels and warriors, told slowly, told calmly, told in the voice of a bedtime narrator who has played these campaigns himself, late at night, on cold winter evenings, when sleep would not come. You do not need to know the game. You do not need to follow every detail. You can let your eyes close. You can let the stories carry you into sleep. The campaigns of medieval history will continue without you. They have continued for centuries. They will go on long after this video has been forgotten. Breathe slowly. Settle in. The torches are lit. The town centers stand. The villagers are gathering food. The first campaign begins. In the late 13th century, the Kingdom of Scotland was in trouble. The Scottish royal line had died out. Multiple claimants competed for the throne. The neighboring English king, Edward I, known to history as Longshanks because of his great height, was invited to arbitrate. He arbitrated by taking Scotland for himself. He installed a weak Scottish king who would obey his orders. When the Scottish nobles objected, he invaded. He sacked the Scottish city of Berwick. He killed thousands. He carried off the Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings, and took it back to London, where it would remain for 700 years. The Scots were beaten. They were occupied. Their nobles had largely sworn loyalty to Edward. Resistance seemed impossible. Then a man named William Wallace rose up. Wallace was not a noble. He was a minor knight from the lowlands. He had grown up watching the English garrisons take whatever they wanted from the Scottish people. He had, by some accounts, lost his wife to English soldiers. He had every reason for personal vengeance. But what he started was bigger than personal vengeance. He gathered followers, other knights who had refused to swear to Edward, common men with longbows, spearmen from the Highland clans. They were not an army at first. They were a band of outlaws living in the forests, attacking English patrols, vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. But Wallace was a natural leader. His band grew. By 1297, he had thousands. He marched on the English-occupied castles of southern Scotland. He took them one by one. He killed the English sheriffs who had taxed his people. The legend grew. Common Scots, hearing of his successes, came to join him. The English king sent an army to crush the rebellion. The army marched north. It met Wallace's forces at a place called Stirling Bridge. The bridge was narrow. The English army was much larger than Wallace's, but they had to cross the bridge in single file. Wallace waited until enough of them had crossed to commit themselves, but before the bulk of the army could come over. Then he attacked. The English on the Scottish side of the river were trapped. They were slaughtered. The river was full of bodies. The English on the south side of the river could only watch. It was one of the great upsets of medieval military history. A force of common Scots had defeated the army of the greatest king of the age. Wallace was made guardian of Scotland. For a brief time, he was the most powerful man in the country. He invaded northern England. He burned villages. He took the war into the lands of his enemies. But the English King Edward was patient. He gathered a larger army. He invaded again. The two forces met at Falkirk in 1298. This time, Wallace did not have the terrain on his side. The English knights smashed through his lines. The Scots were defeated. Many died. Wallace himself escaped, but his political power was broken. He went into exile in France. He returned, years later, to fight on as a guerrilla leader. By this point, most of the Scottish nobility had reconciled with Edward. Wallace was in many ways alone. He was eventually betrayed by a Scottish knight who turned him over to the English in exchange for political favors. The English took Wallace to London. They tried him for treason. The charge made little sense, because Wallace had never sworn loyalty to the English king. But the trial was for show. The verdict had been decided in advance. His execution was brutal beyond modern imagination. He was hanged but not allowed to die. He was disemboweled while still alive. He was beheaded. His body was cut into quarters, and the quarters were displayed at 4 different cities, a warning to anyone who might dream of rebellion. But Wallace's death did not end the rebellion. It became its motto. A few years after Wallace's death, another Scottish noble named Robert the Bruce took up the cause. The Bruce had fought on both sides at different times. He had been with the English, then with the Scots, then back. But after Wallace's death, something changed in him. He committed to the Scottish cause. He had himself crowned king at Scone. He fought for the next 7 years. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce led the Scots to a stunning victory over the English. Scottish independence was, for a time, secured. The wars of Scottish independence ended. Wallace's death had been the spark. The Bruce's victory had been the flame. The Age of Empires campaign of William Wallace was traditionally the introduction campaign for the game. It taught players the basics: how to gather wood, how to build houses, how to train soldiers. As you advanced through it, you replayed his rise, the recruitment of followers, the ambush of English patrols, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, the disaster at Falkirk, the defiant final years. The campaign ended with a brief mention of Robert the Bruce, completing what Wallace had begun. The historical accuracy of the campaign was, by gaming standards, quite high. The cinematic cutscenes were narrated with a Scottish accent. The voice actor, even today, is famous in the AoE community. Sleep gently. The first campaign of Age of Empires 2 is the rebellion of an entire people. It taught players the game. It also taught them quietly a piece of real history, that sometimes a single person with enough conviction starts something that outlasts them by centuries. A century and a half after the death of William Wallace, in a different kingdom, facing a different war, another impossible figure emerged. The 100 Years' War between France and England had been going on for almost a century by 1429. The English had won mostly. They held northern France. They held Paris. They had divided the French royal house. The crown prince of France, the Dauphin, was uncrowned, weak, half defeated, hiding in the south of his country while his enemies divided his lands. The most strategic remaining city in French hands was Orleans. It sat at a crossing of the Loire River. If Orleans fell, the English would push deep into southern France. The Dauphin would lose his last refuge. The war would effectively be over. The English would rule France. The English had been besieging Orleans for months. The city was running out of food. The French commanders were demoralized. The end seemed close. Then a teenage girl arrived at the Dauphin's court. Her name was Joan. She came from a small village called Domremy in the east of France. She was a peasant. She could not read or write. She had spent her childhood watching sheep and going to mass. She had no military training. She had no political connections. But she had visions. She said that since the age of 13, She had been receiving messages from the saints. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret. They had told her that she was to lead the Dauphin's armies to victory. She was to drive the English out of France. She was to see the Dauphin crowned king at Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings. She had walked across the country to reach the Dauphin. She had convinced local commanders to give her a horse. She had cut her hair short and dressed in men's armor. She had crossed enemy territory. By the time she arrived at the Dauphin's court, her reputation had preceded her. She was either a saint or a witch or completely mad. The Dauphin agreed to receive her. He tested her. He had a courtier dress as the Dauphin and hid himself in the crowd. Joan, when she entered the hall, walked past the dressed-up courtier and went straight to the real Dauphin. She told him that she had been sent to him by God. She knelt. She kissed his knee. The Dauphin was uncertain. His theologians examined her. They could find no evidence that she was lying. She seemed sincere. Her piety was beyond question. She was a virgin. They verified this with the formal medical examinations of the period. The Dauphin made a decision. He gave Joan armor, a banner, and a small army. He sent her to Orleans. When she arrived at the city, she did something simple but transformative. She inspired the men. She rode at the front. She rallied. She did not retreat when fired upon. She charged the English siege works directly. Her own captains were astonished. They could not match her energy. They followed her. Within 9 days, she had broken the English siege. The English had to retreat. Orleans was saved. She continued the campaign. She defeated English forces at smaller battles. She led the Dauphin to Reims. He was crowned King of France in the cathedral. Joan stood beside him during the ceremony. The momentum of the war shifted. The French began to win battles. The English began to lose ground. Joan had, in a few months, changed the entire trajectory of a war that had been going on for nearly 100 years. But she pushed too far. She tried to take Paris. She failed. She continued to fight against the advice of more cautious commanders. She was captured during a skirmish at Compiègne. The Burgundians, French allies of the English, handed her over to the English in exchange for a ransom. The English tried her for heresy. The charge focused on her men's clothing, which the Church considered a sin, and on her claim of direct communication with the saints, which the Church considered presumptuous in someone without proper religious training. The trial was a long, careful affair. The judges were French clergy who were loyal to the English. They wanted a conviction. Joan defended herself, alone, against trained theologians for days. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have an advocate. She did have, by all accounts, an extraordinary natural intelligence and a quick tongue. In the end, she was convicted. She was sentenced to be burned at the stake. She was 19 years old. She was tied to a stake in the market square of Rouen. The fire was lit. She asked for a small wooden cross to hold. A sympathetic Englishman in the crowd made her one from sticks and gave it to her. She held it as the flames rose. She called out the name of Jesus until the smoke choked her. She died. Her death did not save the English. The French momentum she had created continued. Within 22 years of her execution, the English had been driven out of France entirely. The 100 Years' War ended with French victory. The crown that Joan had set on the Dauphin's head endured. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her. The girl they had burned for heresy became Saint Joan of Arc. The Age of Empire's 2 Joan of Arc campaign was the second main campaign of the original game. It walked players through her career, the arrival at the Dauphin's court, the relief of Orleans, the campaign through northern France, the crowning at Reims, the defeat, the capture. The campaign did not show her trial or her execution. The game ended with her capture, leaving the player to know the rest of the history from outside the game. The campaign was famous among AoE players for its difficulty. The early missions, where Joan herself was a hero unit, were thrilling. The later missions, where you had to defend French cities against renewed English assaults, were brutal. Sleep Gently, a 19-year-old peasant girl with no education, changed the course of a war between the two greatest kingdoms of medieval Europe. Then she was burned. Then she was made a saint. The pattern of history is sometimes very strange. A century and a half before Joan of Arc, in the deserts of the eastern Mediterranean, a Kurdish warrior named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, was building an empire. The Crusader states had been founded in 1099. After the First Crusade had taken Jerusalem from its Muslim rulers, the Crusaders had established a network of Christian kingdoms across the Levant. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. They were held together by a small but devoted military aristocracy of European knights, supplemented by the great religious orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. For nearly a century, the Crusader kingdoms held. The Muslim world around them was divided. The Sunni Caliph in Baghdad had no real power. The Shia Fatimid caliphs in Egypt were declining. The various Muslim emirs and sultans of the region fought each other as often as they fought the Crusaders. Saladin changed that. He rose from a junior officer in the army of the Zingid dynasty to become the vizier of Egypt. Then, when his patron died, he took control of Egypt himself. He unified Egypt and Syria under one Muslim ruler for the first time in centuries. He defeated rival Muslim leaders. He brought the resources of two great kingdoms under one command. Then he turned his attention to the Crusaders. He was a careful general. He waited for them to make mistakes. The Crusaders had a fatal weakness. Their kingdoms could only field small armies, because their adult male population was limited. If Saladin could destroy the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a single battle, the kingdom itself would fall. He arranged a trap. He invaded the territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He besieged the small city of Tiberias, near the Sea of Galilee. The Crusader army gathered to relieve the siege. The Crusaders marched in summer. The land was dry. There was no water on the route they chose. They had been warned. They marched anyway, hoping for speed. Saladin's army harassed them as they marched. They did not let the Crusaders rest. They cut off their water sources. By the time the Crusader army reached the Horns of Atene, a twin-peaked hill near the Sea of Galilee, they were dying of thirst. Their horses were dying. Their armor was unbearable in the heat. Saladin's army surrounded them. Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass around them, making the heat worse. The battle was a disaster for the Crusaders. They could not fight. They could not retreat to water. The infantry broke and ran for the lake. They were cut down. The knights, slower in their heavy armor, were captured. Saladin captured most of the leadership of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He executed the Templars and Hospitallers in a public ceremony. The great religious orders were considered too dangerous to release. He ransomed the noble knights. He kept the king of Jerusalem himself as a prisoner. With the Kingdom of Jerusalem's army destroyed, Saladin moved quickly. He took city after city. Tiberias, Acre, Sidon, Beirut, each fell with little resistance. The cities had no garrison. Then he came to Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem was full of refugees from the captured cities. It had no army to speak of. The defenders were civilians and clergy. They knew they could not hold. The negotiations were tense. The Crusaders' last commander, Balian of Ibelin, threatened to destroy the holy sites of Islam within the city if Saladin sacked it. Saladin, in turn, threatened to slaughter every Christian in the city. In the end, they reached a deal. Saladin would take the city peacefully. The Christian inhabitants could ransom themselves for gold. Those who could not pay would be enslaved, but there would be no general massacre. The deal held. Saladin entered Jerusalem in 1187. The cross was taken down from the Dome of the Rock. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was restored. Christian pilgrims were allowed to come and worship in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on payment of a fee. Saladin's clemency was, by the standards of the medieval world, remarkable. When the Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, they had slaughtered the entire Muslim and Jewish population. Saladin spared the Christians. The fall of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade. The greatest kings of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, gathered armies and sailed for the Holy Land. The Third Crusade lasted 3 years. It was led, on the Christian side, mostly by Richard. Frederick had drowned crossing a river in Anatolia. Philip had gone home after a brief stay. Richard was alone, facing Saladin. The two great commanders met repeatedly. Richard won the open battles. Saladin won the war of attrition. The Crusaders retook the coastal cities, but could not retake Jerusalem itself. After 3 years of fighting, the two sides made peace. The Crusaders kept a strip of coastal territory. Saladin kept Jerusalem and the interior. Christians were allowed access to the holy sites as pilgrims. Saladin died of fever in 1193, not long after the war ended. He died poor. He had given his wealth to charity throughout his life and had little left at his death. He was mourned across the Muslim world. He was eventually even respected by his European enemies. Dante, in the Divine Comedy, plays Saladin in limbo with the great virtuous pagans, rather than in hell with the other Muslims, a remarkable acknowledgement of Saladin's character. The Age of Empires II Saladin campaign was the third campaign in the original game. It walked the player through his rise, the early missions in Egypt, the unification of Syria, the Battle of Aten, the capture of Jerusalem, the campaigns against the Crusaders. It was, among AoE players, one of the most beloved campaigns. The voice actor for Saladin was widely praised. The cutscenes had a particular tone, calm, philosophical, somewhat melancholy. Saladin was portrayed not as a triumphalist conqueror, but as a thoughtful leader carrying out what he believed was his duty. Sleep gently. The great medieval war between Christianity and Islam was, in some ways, a war between civilizations who never quite understood each other. But both produced figures of remarkable moral seriousness. Saladin was one of them. His enemies eventually came to admire him. In the late 12th century, on the steppes of Mongolia, a child named Temujin was born to a minor chieftain of a Mongol clan. His father was poisoned when Temujin was a small boy. The clan abandoned the family. Temujin's mother and his siblings were left to survive on their own in the harsh grasslands. They survived by hunting marmots and eating roots. They were always hungry. Temujin grew up tough, resourceful, and angry. He killed his older half-brother in a dispute over food. He learned to fight before he learned to read, though he never did learn to read. By the age of 20, Temujin had begun to gather followers. He was a natural leader. He was generous with his men. He was utterly ruthless with his enemies. He kept his word, sometimes in ways that surprised others. He did not betray his oaths, even when betraying them would have been convenient. This was unusual on the steppes. The Mongols admired him for it. He united the Mongol tribes. He defeated his rivals one by one. Some he killed. Others he absorbed into his growing army. By 1206, when he was about 40 years old, he had been proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler of all the Mongol peoples. He was now the ruler of a confederation of nomadic tribes with no cities, no industry, and a population of perhaps 1 million people total. He had perhaps 100,000 mounted warriors. He was about to use them to conquer the largest land empire in human history. He started with northern China. The Jin dynasty ruled the north of China at this time. They considered themselves civilized. They considered the Mongols barbarians. They built walls to keep the Mongols out. The Great Wall existed for exactly this purpose. Genghis did not respect the wall. He went around it where he could. He went over it where he had to. He brought Chinese siege engineers, captured from cities he had already taken, to help him take more cities. He learned. He adapted. He used Chinese technology against the Chinese. The Mongol army was unlike anything the settled civilizations had seen. Every Mongol man was a soldier. They had been riding since they could walk. They could shoot arrows accurately from horseback at full gallop. They could ride for days without rest. They could survive on dried milk and dried meat, supplemented by horse blood drawn from their own mounts when food ran low. The army moved in coordinated formations across vast distances. The Mongols had a system of messenger relays, fresh horses every 20 miles, that allowed them to communicate across empires faster than any civilization before them. A message from Karakorum could reach the edge of Persia in days. When they took a city, they would offer terms. Surrender, and the inhabitants would be spared and made subjects. Resist, and the city would be utterly destroyed, every man killed, every woman enslaved, every child enslaved. The choice was clear. Most cities surrendered, those that did not face catastrophe. The Mongol army moved across Asia like a wave. Northern China fell. Then the Khwarezmian Empire, a Persian-influenced state covering modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Then southern Russia. Then the Caucasus. Then deeper into Persia. The destruction was beyond imagining. Cities of hundreds of thousands of people were utterly destroyed. The libraries of Baghdad, the greatest library of the medieval world, were thrown into the Tigris River. The waters ran black with ink. The agricultural systems of Persia, vast irrigation networks built over centuries, were destroyed. Some of these systems were never rebuilt. The desertification of parts of Central Asia, the Mongols accelerated. But the Mongols also did things unprecedented for any empire. They allowed religious freedom in their territories. They patronized Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Taoists, and shamans alike. They established a postal system. They standardized weights and measures across their domain. They made the Silk Road safer than it had ever been. Trade flowed freely from China to Europe. European missionaries traveled to the Mongol court. Chinese silk reached Europe in unprecedented quantities. The Black Death itself traveled west along the Mongol-controlled trade routes, a dark consequence of the openness they had created. Genghis Khan died in 1227. He was around 60. He had been campaigning until the end. He died on a campaign against the Western Xia. His body was carried back to Mongolia. He was buried somewhere in his homeland. The exact location was kept secret. The soldiers who attended the burial were killed so that they could not reveal it. His tomb has never been found. His sons and grandsons continued the conquests. Within 50 years of his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea in the east to Hungary in the west, from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the deserts of Arabia in the south. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It would never be matched. The Age of Empires II Genghis Khan campaign was the fourth main campaign of the original game. The players started as Temujin, a minor leader, and built up from there. The campaign covered the unification of the Mongols, the wars in northern China, the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, and the great raids into Russia and Eastern Europe. It was famous, among players for the scale of its battles. The later missions involved enormous Mongol armies. The horseback shooting mechanic, the cavalry archers who could shoot while moving, was central to Mongol strategy in the game, as it had been in reality. Sleep gently. The conqueror who lived in tents and could not read changed the world more than almost any emperor who lived in palaces. The Mongol moment was brief. Within a century, the great empire had fragmented, but its effects shaped the world for centuries afterward. We go back now, 800 years before Genghis, to the 5th century of the Common Era, to the steppes north of the Black Sea, to another nomadic horse people, the Huns. The Huns had been migrating west for over a century. They had displaced the Goths, who had then displaced the Romans in the western provinces. The whole great migration of peoples, the wandering of nations across Europe, had been set in motion in part by Hun pressure from the east. By the time Attila was born, around 406 of the Common Era, the Huns were established in Central Europe. They had their own kingdom, a loose confederation of tribes based around what is now Hungary. They were rich. They had been extorting tribute from the Roman Empire for decades. The Romans paid them gold to leave Roman territory alone. Attila and his older brother Bleda inherited the throne from their uncle. They ruled jointly for about a decade. Then Attila murdered Bleda. He took sole control of the Hunnic Empire. He was a fearsome figure. He was short, broad, with a large head and small eyes. He spoke in a deliberate, controlled manner. He almost never laughed. His own followers feared him. His enemies, when they saw him, often wept. His strategy was simple. Attack a wealthy region. Extort enormous tribute. Move on to the next region. Repeat. He did not want to occupy lands. He wanted to be paid, not to attack. He attacked the Eastern Roman Empire first. He moved his armies through the Balkans, sacking cities, burning churches. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius II paid increasingly large bribes to make him leave. The bribes grew until the imperial treasury was nearly empty. Theodosius's successors, the Eastern emperors after him, finally refused to keep paying. Attila then turned west. The Western Roman Empire was a shell of its former self. Most of its provinces were already lost. The capital had moved from Rome to Ravenna. The emperor was a child whose policies were dictated by his older sister, Honoria. Honoria, as a young woman, had been involved in a scandal. She had been caught in an affair with her chamberlain. She had been banished to a convent. From a convent, she sent a letter to Attila. She sent him her engagement ring. She asked for his help. Attila chose to interpret this as a marriage proposal. He claimed Honoria as his bride and demanded half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. The Western Romans refused. Attila invaded. He marched his army into Gaul. He sacked cities. The Western Empire, in desperation, allied with the Visigoths, the same people who had sacked Rome 40 years earlier. Together, the Romans and Visigoths met Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. It was one of the great battles of late antiquity. Tens of thousands died on both sides. The Visigothic king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting, but the Roman-Visigoth alliance held. Attila retreated. It was one of the only major defeats of his career, but he was not finished. The following year, 452, he invaded Italy. He moved south. He sacked cities: Padua, Verona, Milan. He approached Rome itself. Then something happened that medieval Christians would tell for centuries as a miracle. Pope Leo I went out to meet Attila. The Pope traveled with a small delegation. He met the Hun king at the river Mincio. They spoke. We do not know what was said. After the meeting, Attila turned his army around and went home. He did not sack Rome. Different theories have been offered. Maybe Attila was struck by religious awe. Maybe he was paid an enormous bribe. Maybe his army was already starving and could not sustain a longer campaign. Maybe a plague had broken out in the Italian summer. Maybe all of these. Attila returned to his kingdom in Hungary. He planned another invasion of the Eastern Empire for the following year. But that year, 453, he was found dead in his bed on the morning after his wedding to a new young bride. The cause of death is debated. Some accounts say he had a nosebleed and choked on his own blood. Others suggest he was poisoned. The bride, who was said to be weeping by his body the next morning, was suspected. She had been the daughter of a German tribal leader Attila had killed in a recent campaign. Revenge was a plausible motive. With Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire collapsed within a few years. His sons fought each other. The tribes that had been held together by his force of personality dispersed. The Huns vanished as a unified force from history. The peoples they had ruled, Goths, Gepids, Alans, others, went their separate ways and became part of the larger story of post-Roman Europe. The Age of Empires to Attila, the Hun campaign, came in the Conqueror's expansion, the second expansion of the original game. The campaign was beloved by players because of its narrative arc. The player rose with Attila from a minor chieftain to the scourge of Europe. The missions covered the brother murder, the extortion of the Eastern Empire, the invasion of Gaul, the defeat at the Catalonian plains, the invasion of Italy, and the meeting with Pope Leo. The cinematic style of the Attila campaign was particularly dark, appropriate for one of the most fearsome figures of medieval European history. Sleep gently. The empires of horsemen come and go. They strike fear. They take gold. They sometimes overturn civilizations, but they also sometimes vanish as fast as they came. The Hunnic Empire lasted, at its height, perhaps 30 years. It is remembered in the West as one of the great catastrophes of late antiquity. We go now to medieval Spain, to the late 11th century, to a divided peninsula where Christian and Muslim kingdoms competed for territory. Spain had been ruled by Muslims since the early 8th century. The Caliphate of Córdoba, at its height, had been the most sophisticated state in Western Europe. Córdoba had been the largest city in Western Europe. It had had libraries that contained more books than all the libraries of Christian Europe combined. It had had paved streets, public baths, street lighting, running water. It had been a marvel. But by the 11th century, the Cordoban Caliphate had fragmented into smaller kingdoms, the Taifas. They fought each other as often as they fought the Christians. The Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile, Leon, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, were slowly pushing south. The long process called the Reconquista, the Reconquest, was underway. It would take another 4 centuries to complete. In the middle of this complex political landscape, a Castilian noble named Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known to history as El Cid, pursued a career of remarkable complexity. He was born around 1043 in a small Castilian village. He was raised at the court of the Castilian king. He distinguished himself early as a warrior. He was given command of armies. He won battles for the king of Castile against rival Christian kings. Then he fell out of favor. The reasons are obscure. Court intrigues. A perceived insult. He was exiled. What followed was the unusual part. El Cid, exiled from Christian Castile, offered his sword to the Muslim king of Zaragoza. The Muslim king accepted. El Cid spent years fighting in the service of a Muslim ruler, against both Muslim rivals and Christian rivals. He won. He won so consistently that he became famous across the peninsula. His Muslim employer praised him. His Christian enemies feared him. He acquired the title El Cid, from the Arabic Al-Sayyid, the Lord. He became, in some ways, the most powerful warlord in the peninsula despite being a foreign exile in someone else's service. The Christian king of Castile eventually called him back. The wars against the Almoravids, a new and aggressive Berber dynasty that had come from North Africa to support the Spanish Muslims, required El Cid's skill. El Cid returned. He fought for the king again, but again, after another political dispute, he was exiled a second time. This time, El Cid pursued his own independent campaign. He marched south. He attacked the wealthy Muslim kingdom of Valencia. Valencia was one of the richest cities in the peninsula. It was held by a sophisticated Muslim governor. It was protected by powerful walls. El Cid. The siege lasted 20 months. The defenders ate horses, then dogs, then leather, then each other. The city eventually surrendered. El Cid took Valencia and ruled it as his own. He was not a Castilian governor under the king. He was not a Muslim governor under the king of Zaragoza. He was his own ruler. He was, for a few years at the end of his life, the king of Valencia in all but name. He died in 1099, the same year that the Crusaders took Jerusalem. The two events are sometimes seen as bookends of the same age of religious warfare. After his death, his widow Jimena tried to hold Valencia. The Almoravids besieged it for 2 years. Eventually, Jimena had to abandon the city. The Christians evacuated. Jimena set fire to Valencia as they left, so that the Muslims would inherit only ashes. Valencia would not return to Christian control for another century and a half. The legend of El Cid grew after his death. He became, in Christian retellings, a pure Christian hero, a defender of the faith against the Muslim infidel. The earlier years of his career, when he had served the Muslims, were either ignored or rationalized. He became, in the Spanish national imagination, a kind of Catholic Roland. In one famous legend, his body, after his death, was tied to his horse Babieca. The horse rode out at the head of the Castilian army. The Muslim soldiers, seeing what they believed to be El Cid still in the saddle, fled in terror. The Christians won the battle. El Cid had won posthumously through pure reputation. The historical El Cid was more complicated. He had been a mercenary, a politician, a warlord. He had served Christians and Muslims with equal commitment to whoever was paying him. He had been exiled twice by Christian kings he supposedly served. He had carved out a personal kingdom by force. He was, in this sense, one of the most realistic medieval figures we know, neither pure hero nor pure villain. A skilled warrior pursuing his own interests in a world where personal interests and political loyalties shifted constantly. The Age of Empires 2 El Cid campaign came in the Conqueror's expansion. It was famous for its difficulty and for its moral ambiguity. The player switched sides between Christian and Muslim factions during the campaign. The missions reflected the historical reality. El Cid was a complex figure, and the campaign tried to honor that. Sleep gently. The world in which El Cid lived was one of shifting alliances and complicated loyalties. The simple story we sometimes want, Christians on one side, Muslims on the other, pure heroes for our team, was rarely how it actually was. Real people, in real history, made compromises. El Cid was a master of compromise. He won, in the end, because he was good at it. We end with one more campaign. Barbarossa. Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, the red-bearded emperor who tried, for 40 years, to make the Holy Roman Empire into a real empire. Frederick was born around 1122. He came from the powerful Hohenstaufen family of southern Germany. He was crowned king of Germany in 1152. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1155. He reigned for 38 years. The Holy Roman Empire he inherited was not, by modern standards, an empire. It was a loose confederation of German principalities, free cities, ecclesiastical states, and northern Italian cities. all theoretically owing loyalty to the emperor, all in practice doing largely as they pleased. The emperor was elected by the great princes of Germany. He had limited tax revenues. He had no standing army. He had no permanent capital. Frederick wanted to change this. He wanted a real empire with real central authority, modeled on the ancient Roman Empire whose name he had inherited. He spent his reign trying. He made 6 separate military campaigns into northern Italy, trying to assert imperial authority over the wealthy Italian cities. The cities Milan, Brescia, Cremona, others resisted fiercely. They formed the Lombard League to fight back. They won some battles. They lost others. Frederick sacked Milan in 1162, but the League regrouped. Eventually, after the Battle of Legnano in 1176, the League defeated Frederick decisively. He signed the Peace of Constance, which gave the Italian cities most of what they wanted. In Germany, he had similar struggles. The great dukes of Germany were almost independent. Frederick fought wars against them. He won most of them. He extended imperial authority, but he never quite made the empire centralized in the way he wanted. Despite the political frustrations, Frederick was a successful military leader. His armies won most of their battles. His personal courage was famous. He was respected, even by enemies. He gave the Holy Roman Empire perhaps its most coherent identity in its long history. He died in an unusual way. In 1190, when he was about 68 years old, he set out with a great army on the Third Crusade, the same crusade that took Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus to the Holy Land. Frederick's army was the largest contingent. It marched east across Anatolia. He drowned crossing a river. The river was the Salef in southern Turkey. He had gone for a swim to cool off in the heat. The current was stronger than he expected. He went under. His attendants pulled him out, but he was already dead. His army, devastated, lost its cohesion. Many soldiers turned back. Only a small portion continued on to the Holy Land to join Richard. The crusade was significantly weaker without Frederick's army. In the legends that grew after his death, Frederick did not die. He was sleeping in a cave under the Kyffhauser mountain in Germany. His beard had grown long, growing through the stone table where he slept. When Germany was in its greatest hour of need, the legends said Frederick would awaken. He would emerge from the cave. He would lead Germany to glory. For 700 years, this legend was retold. It became part of the German imagination. When the German Empire was finally unified in 1871, under Bismarck and the kings of Prussia, there was discussion of declaring that the legend had been fulfilled. The new emperor, Wilhelm I, was called Barba Blanca, Whitebeard, partly in reference to Barbarossa's prophecy. The Age of Empires II Barbarossa campaign was the 5th main campaign of the original game. The player led Frederick through his various wars in Germany and Italy. The campaign was famous for its complexity. The player had to manage relationships with multiple Italian cities, balance conquest with diplomacy, deal with rebellions, and ultimately march on the Third Crusade. The campaign ended, of course, with Frederick's death in the Salef River, a moment that was, in the game's cinematic, treated with appropriate gravity. Sleep gently. Some legends do not need to be true to shape a people. The German imagination, for centuries, held Barbarossa as a sleeping king who would one day return. He has not yet returned. He may not, but the dream of him lingered, as the dreams of medieval kings sometimes do. 6 campaigns. 6 medieval figures who shaped the world. William Wallace, the Scottish outlaw who briefly held off the King of England. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who broke the siege of Orleans. Saladin, the Kurdish warrior who took back Jerusalem. Genghis Khan, the steppe rider who built the largest empire in history. Attila, the Hun who terrified the Roman world. El Cid, the Castilian mercenary who switched sides and made himself a king. Barbarossa, the red-bearded German emperor who tried to make the Holy Roman Empire whole. These are not the only figures in Age of Empires 2. The game has many more. The expansions added Italians, Aztecs, Mayans, Incas, Berbers, Ethiopians, Malians, Portuguese, Burmese, Khmer, Vietnamese, Malay, Tatars, Cumans, Bulgarians. Each civilization came with its own historical context. Each campaign told its own story. The game has lasted, in some form, for over 25 years. It is still being updated. The definitive edition that came out in 2019 brought it to modern hardware with modern graphics. New campaigns have been added every year since. The game is still played by hundreds of thousands of people. Tournaments are held. Streamers cover it. Communities continue. What the game has done, perhaps without intending to, is teach generations of players a particular kind of medieval history. The kind that is not in textbooks. The kind that is felt rather than memorized. You played as Wallace, and you came to know his rebellion. You played as Saladin, and you came to understand the Crusades from the other side. You played as Genghis, and you saw the step perspective on the world. Sleep gently. The medieval world is far away. The kingdoms are gone. The kings are dust. But their stories, retold through pixels on a screen and through the voice of a narrator like the one speaking to you now, continue. You may have fallen asleep long ago. That is fine. The campaigns will be here tomorrow if you want to play them, or to watch others play them, or just to remember them. Whatever you are doing while you listen, at home, in bed, on a long drive, with the lights low, you are part of the tradition of people who have heard these stories and kept them alive. The torches still burn in the town center. The villagers gather wood. Somewhere on a distant hill, a knight rides toward a far-off city. The cinematic ends. The next mission begins. Sleep well. Good night. Or good morning. Or good afternoon. Whatever it is. The empires rise and fall. The night is long. You can rest now.